I remember that day far too clearly. My name's Lucas. I'm 28, and 2 weeks ago we buried my dad. It was one of those cold, gray mornings where the air feels heavy, like even the weather knew something final was happening. My dad and I had a complicated relationship. Not bad, just complicated. He was a quiet man, not one for big speeches or emotional heart-to-hearts, but he taught me about patience, how to listen before talking, and how to stand my ground when it mattered. I loved him, even when we didn't agree. The funeral itself was somber but beautiful. Friends, co-workers, old neighbors, everyone came. By the time we all gathered for the reception at my aunt's place, I thought I was emotionally spent. I thought I could just sit, have a drink, let the memories settle. But apparently my family had other plans. It happened right after dessert. My older brother, Mark, 33, loud, and always the alpha in every room, stood up, clinked his glass with a spoon, and grinned like he'd just won something. "Guess I'm the man of the house now," he said, lifting his drink. "Hope you're ready to listen to me." People laughed awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke. My mom didn't hesitate, though. She actually nodded, her lips pressed in that little approving way she always saved for him, and said, "That's right. Everything goes through him now." I didn't say a word. I just sat there, sipping my drink, letting that sting settle in. Because it did sting, not just what they said, but the way the whole room kind of accepted it, like this was just the natural order of things. Mark had always been the golden child. The kid who got the new car at 16 while I was handed my dad's rusty pickup. The one whose college tuition was paid in full while I had to work weekends and take loans. It wasn't a mystery who my parents favored, but something about hearing it that day, at that table, right after we put dad in the ground, that was different. I could feel my jaw tightening as Mark launched into some rambling story about how he'd take care of things now, like he was inheriting a kingdom. I let him have his moment. Because sitting just 2 tables away was my dad's lawyer, quiet, eating a piece of pie. And I knew exactly what was about to happen next. The thing is, what my family didn't know, what they never cared to ask about, was how close Dad and I actually were in the last few years. After Mark moved out and started his family, I started visiting Dad more often. We worked on his old motorcycle together, had quiet Saturday barbecues, and even took a road trip last year, just the two of us. Somewhere along the line, our relationship changed. I became more than just the younger son. I became the person he confided in. And because of that, I knew about the will. As Mark kept talking, I noticed a few relatives exchanging looks. Even my aunt seemed a little uncomfortable with how smug he sounded. "Everything goes through him now." Mom's words kept echoing in my head. She looked almost relieved, like she could finally pass the torch and not worry about anything anymore. I finished my drink, set it down, and glanced toward the lawyer. He caught my eye, gave me the smallest nod, and reached for his briefcase. My heart started pounding. This was the moment. Mark was in the middle of explaining how he was going to handle Dad's tools and probably sell the cabin when the lawyer cleared his throat. The room went quiet. Even Mark stopped talking mid-sentence, his smug smile flickering for just a second. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lawyer said, standing. "At the request of the family, I'll be reading the last will and testament of Mr. Daniel Pierce." You could feel the shift in the room. Some people straightened in their seats. My mom folded her hands in her lap. Mark sat back with that same little smirk, probably expecting to hear his name over and over again. But I already knew what was written. And in that moment, sitting there with everyone's eyes darting between me, Mark, and the lawyer, I felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't felt all day. Because this was the part where everything they thought they knew about who runs the house now was about to come crashing down. And I just sat there, waiting. The lawyer pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope with my dad's neat handwriting across the front. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Everyone leaned forward a little. Even the kids who had been half asleep after dessert were suddenly quiet. "Before we begin," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, "your father wanted me to remind you that this will represent his final wishes." He was very specific about how things should be handled. That made my mom nod again, like she already knew what was coming. Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, like a king waiting for his crown. The lawyer began reading. "My estate, including all property, assets, and personal belongings, is to be distributed as follows." You could feel the collective breath being held. He started with small things, sentimental items. Dad's watch collection was to go to Uncle Jeff. his old fishing gear to Grandpa's best friend. The motorcycle he'd restored was to be given to me. I couldn't help but smile at that. I'd spent months with him in the garage fixing it up. Mark snorted quietly. Figures, he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Then came the part everyone was waiting for. The family cabin, the lawyer continued, is to be kept within the family and maintained as a place of gathering and rest. It is to be held in trust and managed by, he paused, glancing at the page, Lucas Pierce. That was the first crack in Mark's expression. His smirk faltered. What? He said, half laughing. The lawyer ignored him and kept reading. Lucas will have sole discretion over its upkeep, its use, and who is allowed to stay there. My mom turned to me with wide eyes. He gave you the cabin? Seems like it, I said, keeping my voice calm. My heart was beating so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Mark shifted in his chair. That has to be a mistake. Dad told me I could use the cabin whenever I wanted. He said. The lawyer raised a hand. Mr. Pierce was very clear in his instructions. This was his decision. Mark sat back, his jaw tight. But the lawyer wasn't finished. As for the remainder of Mr. Pierce's assets, including the savings accounts, investment portfolio, and the house, every single head in the room turned toward the lawyer. They will be placed into a trust administered by Lucas Pierce, who has been designated executor and trustee. I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, while the words sank into the room like heavy stones. Mark shot forward in his seat. You mean to tell me? The lawyer didn't stop. It was Mr. Pierce's express wish that Lucas manage all financial matters related to the estate. Any disbursements, sales, or changes must go through him. Silence. Absolute, perfect silence. You could practically feel the heat radiating off Mark. His face had gone from pink to red in seconds. This is ridiculous, he spat. I'm the eldest son. I've got a family to take care of. Why would Dad put him in charge? The lawyer folded the will and placed it back into the envelope. Your father left a letter explaining his reasoning. If you'd like me to read it aloud. Yes, I said before anyone else could speak. The lawyer took out a single sheet of paper, his voice calm as ever. Mark, you've always been the loudest voice in the room, but not always the most careful one. Lucas has shown me, and shown you, whether you noticed or not, that he listens, plans, and follows through. This estate is not just about money. It's about stewardship. I trust Lucas to keep this family's future steady. If you respect my memory, you will respect this decision. The room stayed quiet long after the lawyer finished. My mom's face was pale, her lips pressed together so tightly they'd gone white. Mark looked like he was about to explode, his fists clenched on the table. Are you happy now? He said finally, turning to me. I met his glare without flinching. I didn't write the will, Mark. But you knew, he snapped. You knew and you sat there letting me. Letting you what? I said, keeping my voice level. Crown yourself king? Dad made his choice. Mark stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. This isn't over. Sit down, Mom said sharply, surprising everyone. Making a scene isn't going to change anything. But Mark didn't sit. He stormed out of the room, muttering under his breath. I stayed seated, letting the tension hang in the air. Because I knew this was just the beginning, and if I knew Mark, he wasn't going to take this quietly. And part of me almost welcomed it. Because for once in my life, I had the upper hand, and I intended to use it. Mark's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he left, but his presence lingered like smoke. Everyone sat there in silence for a good 30 seconds after he was gone. You could feel the discomfort hanging over the room like thick fog. People shifted in their seats, looking at me, looking at my mom, waiting for someone to say something. Mom broke the silence first. Lucas, she said slowly, her voice carefully controlled. You knew about this? I nodded once. Dad told me a few months ago. He wanted me to be prepared. Her lips tightened. And you didn't think to tell us? I set my glass down. Dad asked me not to. He wanted everyone to hear it at the same time. He said it was the only way to make sure it was taken seriously. That stung her. I could see it in the way her eyes narrowed, like I had just taken her authority and ripped it in half. Your father should have discussed this with me, she said. He did, I said quietly. He told me he tried to talk to you and Mark last year, but every time he brought it up, you both brushed him off. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, looking down at her lap. The lawyer cleared his throat, clearly eager to wrap things up before the family tension spilled over into a full-blown fight. If there are no further questions, he said, I will make copies of the will available to all beneficiaries. Lucas, as executor, I'll need to schedule a meeting with you next week to go over the paperwork. I nodded, feeling everyone's eyes on me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the quiet one sitting in the shadow of my older brother. I was the one with the power, and it scared me just a little, but there was something almost satisfying about it too. As people started to get up and put their coats on, I caught snippets of whispered conversations. Did you know about this? Why, Lucas? Mark's not going to let this go. Oh, I knew he wasn't going to let this go. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind to help my aunt clean up. She was one of the only people who looked genuinely relieved when the will was read. Your dad made the right choice, she said as she rinsed dishes. Mark's got too much pride and not enough patience. He'd sell everything off just to prove a point. That made me pause. You think he'll actually try something? She gave me a sad little smile. Lucas, your brother's been competing with you since the day you were born. Of course he'll try something. I didn't sleep well that night. Sure enough, the first text from Mark came the next morning. Mark, we need to talk. You can't actually be planning to keep everything for yourself. I stared at my phone for a while before replying. Me, we can talk, but I'm following Dad's wishes. He didn't respond right away, which was honestly more unnerving than if he'd just called me and yelled. By that evening, he showed up at my place unannounced. He didn't even knock, just let himself in like he still lived there. His wife, Jessica, was with him, holding their youngest on her hip. She looked uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be there. Nice place, Mark said flatly, glancing around like he was appraising it. Guess being Dad's favorite really paid off. I stood up from the couch, keeping my voice calm. You want to sit down and talk, or do you just want to throw insults? He narrowed his eyes, but Saturday, here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over half of everything. The accounts, the cabin, the tools, and we'll manage them together. I actually laughed. That's not happening, Mark. He leaned forward. You think you can handle this on your own? Managing an estate isn't just a game. There are bills, taxes, upkeep. Yeah, I interrupted. I know. Dad walked me through it all before he passed. He showed me where every file is, every account, every key. He trusted me to handle it. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Mark, she started, but he held up a hand. This isn't fair, he said, his voice getting louder. You've always been the failure. I was the one who stayed in school, got a job, started a family. You were also the one who ignored Dad's calls half the time. I shot back, my patience finally wearing thin. You never visited unless there was a holiday dinner or you needed money. Don't act like you were the dutiful son. His face went red. Careful, he said. No, I said, standing now. I'm done being careful. Dad chose me, not you. Not because I'm perfect, but because I actually listened to him. Jessica looked between us, her expression pained. Mark, maybe we should just respect his wishes, she said softly. He stood up, towering over me. You think this is over? I'll fight this if I have to. I'll get a lawyer. Go ahead, I said, my voice steady. But you'll lose. The will's airtight. Dad made sure of it. He glared at me for a long moment, then turned and stormed out, Jessica following behind him with a resigned look. When the door slammed shut, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline. Because I knew that wasn't the end. That was just round one. Over the next week, little things started happening. Someone accidentally canceled the lawn service at the cabin. A neighbor called to say Mark had been seen poking around the property. I even got a notice from the bank that someone had tried to access one of Dad's accounts without authorization. I started documenting everything. Every text, every call, every strange occurrence. I wasn't going to be blindsided. When I met with Dad's lawyer, I told him what was going on. He nodded gravely. I'll add a protective clause to the trust. If anyone tries to interfere or damage estate property, they forfeit their right to any inheritance. That was exactly what I wanted. By the second week, Mark had gone from subtle interference to outright hostility. He left me a voicemail saying he'd take me to court, that he had a right to half of everything. But I had something he didn't: patience. And I knew if I just let him keep digging, he'd eventually bury himself. I just had to wait for the right moment. And when it came, I was going to make sure the entire family saw exactly who he really was. Because for once, I had the leverage, and I was ready to use it. I didn't have to wait long for the moment to come. 3 weeks later, Mom insisted on having everyone over for a family dinner. Her words, not mine. I knew it was a setup before I even walked in the door. Mark's truck was already in the driveway, and through the window, I could see him pacing near the dining table like he owned the place. Jessica sat quietly next to their kids, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. I walked in carrying the folder I'd been putting together for weeks. Every text, every bank alert, every photo my neighbor had sent of Mark sneaking around the cabin. Mom gave me a tight smile, the kind that was supposed to look polite but didn't reach her eyes. "Lucas," she said, "thank you for coming. We need to clear the air." "Sure," I said, taking my seat but not taking off my coat. I wanted them to know I wasn't planning to stay long. Mark wasted no time. "Here's the deal," he said, slapping the table. "You hand over control of the estate. We split it 50-50, and this family doesn't have to fall apart. Or we can go to court and let a judge deal with it." I stayed quiet for a long moment, letting his words hang in the air. Then I opened the folder and started sliding papers across the table. "Before we talk about splitting anything," I said calmly, "we should go over these." Mark glanced down at the first page, a printed screenshot of the bank alert showing the unauthorized login attempt, and frowned. "What's this supposed to be?" "That's the first time you tried to access Dad's accounts," I said. "Without permission." His face went red, but I kept sliding papers across the table. A copy of the lawn service cancellation, photos of his truck parked at the cabin, and finally a printed transcript of the voicemail he left me threatening to take back what's mine by any means necessary. Jessica's face drained of color. "Mark," she whispered. Mom's expression hardened as she looked from him to me. "You did this?" she asked him, her voice quiet but sharp. Mark pushed back from the table, standing up. "This is ridiculous. He's just twisting everything to make me look bad." "Really?" I said, standing too. "Because the trust clause Dad's lawyer added says if anyone tries to interfere with estate property or finances, they lose their right to inherit. So go ahead, keep pushing. I'll have the lawyer file this tomorrow." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the kids shifting nervously in their seats. Jessica broke the silence. "Mark, sit down," she said firmly. "This has gone far enough." He didn't. He stood there breathing hard, fists clenched, like he was deciding whether to keep fighting or walk away. Finally, he grabbed his keys off the table and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Jessica stayed seated, staring at the folder of evidence. Then she looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't know he'd been doing all this." I nodded. "It's not your fault. But I can't let him wreck everything Dad worked for." When she gathered the kids and left, Mom just sat there staring at her hands. For once, she didn't look angry, just tired. "I never thought it would come to this," she said softly. "Neither did I admitted. "But Dad trusted me to do the right thing. That's what I'm doing." She didn't argue. She just nodded once, like maybe for the first time she finally understood. The next morning, I met with the lawyer and officially filed the breach of trust report. Legally, it meant Mark forfeited any right to the assets. It wasn't an easy decision. He was still my brother, but after everything he'd tried to do, I couldn't risk him coming back for more. When the paperwork was finalized, I drove out to the cabin. The sun was setting, casting the whole lake in this warm, orange glow. I sat on the porch steps with a beer, the sound of crickets and the water lapping at the shore the only things breaking the silence. For the first time since the funeral, I felt at peace. Not triumphant, not smug, just calm. I didn't hear from Mark for months. Word eventually got around that he'd moved a few towns over, took on extra work to cover some debts, and was trying to get back on his feet. Jessica sent me a message a few months later thanking me for not completely cutting them off. I'd made sure the kids could still come up to the cabin during the summer if they wanted. Mom eventually came around too. She started calling more, asking my opinion on things, even inviting me over without Mark being involved. It was awkward at first, but we slowly found some common ground. One afternoon, nearly a year later, I stood in the cabin's kitchen cooking burgers on the old cast-iron skillet Dad used to swear by. I looked around at the photos on the wall, the worn furniture, the fishing poles leaning against the corner, all the little pieces of him that still lived there, and I realized something. This wasn't just about beating Mark or winning. This was about protecting what Dad loved most. And I had done exactly that. When I locked up the cabin that night and stepped outside, the stars were just starting to come out over the lake. I thought about Dad, about that road trip we'd taken, about all the quiet lessons he'd taught me that no one else even knew about. "Don't worry, Dad," I said softly into the night. "I've got it handled." And for the first time since the day we buried him, I actually believed it. My name's Evan, I'm 29, and I never thought I'd be the type to write one of these posts. But what happened over the past few months has been gnawing at me, and I guess I just need to tell someone who doesn't know me. The moment that set everything in motion started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished a call with a client and tossed my phone onto the counter when it started ringing again. Dad. He doesn't usually call in the middle of the day, so I answered. But before I could even say hello, I realized he must not have heard the click when I picked up. There was laughter on the other end, and then his voice, casual but cutting in a way only family can be. He'll never amount to anything. Just a loser living off our name. I froze. It felt like someone had reached through the phone and squeezed my lungs. Then another voice, my mom's, soft and amused, chimed in. "At least he's useful enough to watch the house while we're gone." More laughter. Then the sound of ice clinking in a glass and my dad's voice again. "Yeah, he should be grateful. We could have just rented the place out. He's lucky we even trust him." I didn't hang up right away. I just stood there, listening, my stomach turning into a cold, solid knot. I don't know how long I stayed like that before I quietly pressed the red button on the screen and set the phone down like it had burned me. For a while, I just paced around the living room of the very house they were talking about, my house. Well, technically, I'd bought it 2 years ago with my own money, a place I was proud of because I worked hard to afford it. My parents had been so excited when I told them I was closing on it. At the time, I thought it was genuine pride. I'd invited them to stay with me whenever they wanted, and they took me up on that. They'd been using my house as a kind of base whenever they flew back from their long trips abroad. At first, I liked it. I liked being the good son, the one they could rely on. I told myself that letting them stay here was just my way of giving back for everything they did for me growing up. But as the months passed, I realized their stays were getting longer and more frequent. My pantry would be half empty when they left. My utilities were higher than ever, and every time I mentioned splitting costs, Dad would chuckle and say, "We raised you. You can handle a few bills." I always swallowed my irritation. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, but hearing him say those words, "just a loser living off our name," flipped a switch I didn't know existed. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the floor until the sun came up. I replayed every conversation, every little jab they'd made in passing. The time Dad laughed when I told him I was stressed about my mortgage and said, "If you can't handle this, maybe you shouldn't own a house." The time Mom told me I should be more like my brother, who always makes the smart moves, even though he still lives rent-free in their old house. The next day, when I got a text from Mom saying they'd extended their Europe trip another week, and "hope you're keeping the place nice for us," something inside me went cold and calm at the same time. For the next few days, I went about my routine like normal, but my mind was spinning quietly behind the scenes. I started pulling documents, looking through files, checking what I owned outright and what was still under financing. I called my realtor just to ask about the market, and when she told me houses in my neighborhood were selling in under 2 weeks for insane prices, I felt my chest tighten with a strange mix of fear and excitement. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking. Not my brother, not my friends. I kept smiling through our family group chat, sending pictures of the dog, answering questions about the house like nothing was wrong. But every night I stayed up late, cleaning out closets, going through boxes, donating what I didn't need. Each day the house got a little emptier, and each day I felt a little lighter, and a little more like I was doing something dangerous. Then one night, I found myself standing in the middle of my living room, looking around at the space that had been my home, my refuge, and my burden. And I made my decision. I called my realtor back the next morning and said the words I didn't think I'd say so soon. "Let's list it." By the end of the week, the for sale sign was in my yard. I kept it all secret. Every time my parents called from Europe, I made sure the background behind me looked the same. I made up stories about how quiet things were here, how nice it was to have the place to myself. All the while, I was signing papers, fielding offers, and packing up my life into a storage unit. When I accepted an offer, nearly $980,000, more than I'd even hoped for, I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I felt this slow building current of something like power, humming just under my skin. I moved out a few days before the closing date. The house was nearly bare when I left, just a few light fixtures and curtains left behind for the new owners. On the kitchen counter, I left one thing, a folded piece of paper with 6 words scrawled across it in black marker. The last night before I handed over the keys, I sat in my car outside the empty house and just stared at it. I imagined my parents coming back from Europe, dragging their suitcases up the driveway, laughing like they always do, expecting everything to be the way they left it. And then I imagined their faces when the key didn't turn. I don't know why that thought made me smile, but it did. I didn't know then just how intense their reaction would be, or how far they'd go once they realized what I'd done. When the day finally came, I was hundreds of miles away, sitting in a quiet coffee shop with my laptop open and my phone face down. The house had officially closed the day before. The keys were no longer mine. The only thing that was still mine was the note I left behind, waiting like a fuse ready to be lit. I didn't have to wait long. At 3:17 p.m., my phone started buzzing. First Mom, then Dad, then Mom again. A string of calls one after the other, relentless, until I switched the phone to silent. Then came the texts, first polite, then confused, then angry. Evan, what is going on? The key isn't working. The house is empty. Empty. Where are you? You better have an explanation. Call us now. I didn't answer. I just sat there, sipping my coffee, watching the messages roll in like waves during a storm. There was something almost surreal about it, like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. Then came the photo. It was a picture of my kitchen counter. And there it was, the note I'd left behind, the one with 6 words written in sharp black marker. The family loser did this. No one texted for about 20 minutes after that. I imagined them just standing there in the empty house, trying to process what they were looking at. When Dad finally called again, I let it go to voicemail. I didn't listen to it until much later that night, when I was alone in my new apartment. His voice was low, tight, and angrier than I'd ever heard it. You had no right to do this. We trusted you. You just humiliated this family. Do you have any idea what this looks like? Call me back immediately. I didn't call back. Instead, I went for a long walk through the quiet streets of my new neighborhood. I kept thinking about that word, humiliated. For years, I'd twisted myself into knots trying to avoid doing exactly that to them. I'd bitten my tongue when they belittled me, smiled when they took advantage of my space, nodded and agreed when they told me how I should be living my life. But the truth was, humiliation had been my shadow for years. I just hadn't realized it until I finally stepped out from under it. When I got back to my apartment, there were already voicemails from my brother too. His were different, calmer, but sharper in a way that cut even deeper. What are you doing, Evan? Mom's been crying all night. Dad's furious. You can't just sell the house out from under them. They needed a place to stay. You're being selfish. Selfish. That word used to sting. Now, it just made me tired. The next day, Mom finally got through to me. I let the phone ring twice before answering, bracing myself. Evan, she said, her voice quivering. How could you do this to us? After everything we've done for you. Something inside me snapped, quietly, not loudly like an explosion, but like a rope that had finally frayed all the way through. You mean after everything I've done for you? I said, my voice steady. I let you live there for free. I took care of everything while you were gone. And you called me a loser for it. There was silence on the other end. Then she said, almost whispering, you weren't supposed to hear that. I did, I said, and I'm done pretending I didn't. She started crying again, saying things like, we didn't mean it, and your father was just joking. But every word just sounded like noise now. When I hung up, I realized my hands were shaking, not from anger this time, but from something else. Relief, maybe. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the look I imagined on their faces when they realized the house was gone, the way they must have stood in that empty living room staring at the note. But the more I pictured it, the more I realized this wasn't over. They weren't just going to let this go. And I was right. Over the next week, the calls didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Dad started leaving long, furious voicemails about family loyalty and respect. Mom sent texts saying they were thinking of taking legal action, though I knew they couldn't. I had done everything by the book. But what got to me wasn't the anger. It was how quickly the narrative flipped. Suddenly, I wasn't the good son anymore. I was the traitor, the one who betrayed them. And that's when I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to play by their script anymore. I started ignoring every call, every message. I changed my number. I stopped checking the family group chat entirely. I thought they might back down after a while. I was wrong. One morning, I woke up to find a letter slid under my apartment door. No stamp, no envelope, just a single piece of paper with my dad's handwriting. It said, "You can't run from your family forever." That was the moment I knew this was going to escalate, and that if I didn't take control, they were going to try to pull me back in by force. A week later, it happened. I had just come back from a late evening run, earbuds still in, when I saw a familiar car parked across the street from my apartment building. My stomach dropped. It was Dad's. I almost turned around right there, but before I could react, the driver's door opened and he stepped out. Even from a distance, I could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands were balled into fists. "Evan," his voice cut through the quiet street, sharp enough to make a couple walking their dog turn their heads. "We need to talk." I didn't move. My heart was hammering, but at the same time, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I'd been waiting for this, hadn't I? "Talk about what?" I called back, my voice steadier than I expected. "You know what?" he said, walking toward me. "You think you can just disappear, sell the house, cut us off like we're strangers? You think that's how family works?" I glanced up at the windows of my building. A few lights were on. My neighbors might have been watching. For once, I didn't care. "I didn't cut you off," I said, taking a step toward him. "You did that the second you called me a loser and laughed about it behind my back." He stopped walking, just a few feet away from me now. His face was flushed, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but panic. "You're overreacting," he said finally, his voice lower now, but no less intense. "You sold the house we all loved. Do you understand how humiliating this has been for us? People are asking questions. What are we supposed to tell them?" I let out a bitter laugh before I could stop myself. "You mean your friends? The ones you bragged to about the house I paid for?" His jaw clenched. "Watch your tone." There it was, that old phrase he used to throw at me growing up, anytime I dared to push back. But this time, instead of making me shrink, it just made me stand taller. "No," I said quietly but firmly. "You don't get to talk to me like that anymore. You don't get to use my house, my money, my life as props to make yourself look good, and then call me worthless when I'm not around." For a moment, he just stared at me. I think he expected me to back down, to apologize like I always used to. But I didn't move. When he finally spoke, his voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. "This isn't over. You owe us an explanation. You owe this family something for what you've done." I shook my head slowly. "No, I don't owe you anything." His face went red, and for a second, I thought he might actually shout, but then he just turned on his heel and walked back to the car. He didn't slam the door, didn't peel away. He just sat there for a minute, engine running, before finally driving off. I stood there on the sidewalk long after the taillights disappeared, my chest tight. Part of me felt like I'd just won something. Another part of me felt like I'd just declared war. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my brother. "Dad's furious. Mom hasn't stopped crying. They said they're coming back tomorrow with the rest of the family. You need to be there when they arrive." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back just 2 words, "Not happening." But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end with a few texts and an argument in the street. If they were planning to come here, to force some kind of family meeting, then I needed to be ready. I spent the rest of the day thinking about every possible way this could go. I could ignore them, sure, but I knew them well enough to know that would just make them push harder. By nightfall, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to hide. The next day, I made sure to get home early. I sat in my apartment with the door locked, blinds drawn, waiting for the inevitable knock. When it finally came, 3 sharp raps, like a gavel, my stomach clenched, but I didn't move from the chair by the window. "Evan," Mom's voice called through the door, muffled but pleading. "Please open up. We just want to talk." I stayed silent. A moment later, Dad's voice came, harder, louder. "You can't ignore us forever. You're going to face this family whether you like it or not." I stood, walked slowly to the door, and put my hand on the knob. My heart was racing, but I wasn't scared this time. I was ready. I opened the door, and there they were, Mom, Dad, my brother, and even my aunt and uncle standing behind them like backup. The whole family, gathered in my hallway like some kind of tribunal. No one said anything at first. We just stood there, staring at each other. Then Dad stepped forward. "You're going to explain yourself," he said, his voice low but dangerous. "Right now." I took a step back and gestured for them to come in. If this was going to happen, it was going to happen on my terms. They filed into my apartment one by one, the air heavy with tension. My mom clutched her purse like a shield. My brother kept his arms crossed like he was already siding with Dad, and my aunt and uncle stood stiffly near the wall, clearly there as witnesses more than anything else. Sit, I said quietly, motioning to the couch and chairs. To my own surprise, they actually did. I stayed standing. Dad leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at me like I was a defendant in a courtroom. "We want to know why," he said finally. "Why you sold the house. Why you blindsided us. Why you've turned your back on this family." I let out a slow breath. "You really want to know why?" "Yes," Mom said softly, her eyes wet. "We deserve an explanation." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how absurd it sounded. "You deserve an explanation? After everything you've said about me? After calling me a loser when you thought I couldn't hear?" Mom flinched. Dad's jaw tightened. "That was a private conversation," he said, his voice sharp. "Exactly," I shot back. "And you didn't think I'd ever know how you really feel about me. But I do now. And it changes everything." My brother shifted uncomfortably. "Evan, come on. You're making a huge deal out of one comment. Dad jokes like that all the time." "One comment," I said, feeling my voice rise for the first time. "You think this is about one comment? This is about years of being treated like I'm less than. Years of being told to be grateful, to just smile and let you take what you want, my time, my space, my money, because that's what a good son does." And I did it. I did it for years. But not anymore. My dad stood up now, towering over me, his face red. "You ungrateful little." "Don't," I said, cutting him off. My voice was calm, but it had an edge that made him pause. "Don't go there. I am not ungrateful. I gave you everything I could. I let you live in that house for free. I took care of it when you were gone. I made sure it stayed nice so you'd have somewhere to come back to. And you still laughed at me behind my back. You called me a loser. Well, the loser sold the house. The loser moved on. And the loser is done being treated like dirt." For a moment, the room was completely silent. You could have heard the clock ticking in the kitchen. Mom started crying then, whispering things like, "We didn't mean it," and "You've misunderstood us." But Dad wasn't backing down. "You've embarrassed this family," he said through gritted teeth. "People are talking. Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" "Good," I said flatly. "Maybe they'll stop seeing me as your free handyman and start seeing me as my own person." My uncle finally spoke up, clearly trying to diffuse things. "Maybe everyone needs to calm down. There's still time to fix this." "No," I said, turning to face him. "There's nothing to fix. The house is sold. The money's mine. And none of you get a say in what I do with it." That's when my brother snapped. "You're being selfish, Evan. We all counted on that house. You knew Mom and Dad needed a place to stay when they came back. How could you just take that away? Because it was never their house." I said, my voice shaking now. "It was mine. Mine. And I'm allowed to choose who lives in it. I'm allowed to choose who I open my door to. And I'm allowed to close it when people use me and call me worthless when they think I can't hear." I felt something in my chest loosen as the words came out, like I'd been holding my breath for years and was finally letting it go. Dad just stared at me, his face unreadable now. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "If you walk away from this family, don't expect us to be there for you when you come crawling back." I smiled then, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. "That's the difference between us," I said quietly. "I don't need you to be there. I'm not crawling anywhere." I walked to the door and held it open. "We're done here." No one moved at first. Then Mom stood, tears streaming down her face, and walked past me without saying a word. My aunt and uncle followed, looking uncomfortable. My brother glared at me, but didn't speak. Dad was the last one to leave. He paused in the doorway, staring at me like he was memorizing my face. "You'll regret this," he said finally. "Maybe," I replied, "but at least the decision will be mine." And then he was gone. I stood there for a long time after the door shut, listening to their footsteps fade down the hall. My apartment felt impossibly quiet, but not in a lonely way, in a peaceful way. Over the next few weeks, the calls stopped. The texts stopped. Even the passive-aggressive posts on social media about disrespectful children stopped. It was like they'd all agreed to go silent at once. At first, I thought the silence would hurt, but instead, it felt like healing. I settled into my new place, started a new routine, and slowly realized how much lighter life felt without that constant weight of expectation pressing on me. And then, one afternoon, I got an email from my realtor, a simple one-line message that said, "Your funds have cleared." I stared at the number in my account, the result of selling that house, and for the first time, I felt completely free. I didn't buy another house right away. I traveled. I took a trip to Italy, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt I could justify. I started saying yes to things I used to put off because I was worried about being responsible for everyone else. Months later, I heard through a cousin that my parents had rented a small condo whenever they came back to town now, and that dad was still bitter about the stunt I pulled. But I didn't feel guilt anymore, because it wasn't a stunt. It was me finally choosing myself. And that note I left on the counter, that was the truest thing I'd ever written. The family loser did this. And for the first time, being the loser felt like winning.